Well, welcome everyone to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. This week we bring you something a little different. I have author Drew Dyck with me today talking about his new book, Just Show Up, that's come out. And it tugs on some very crucial issues. Have you ever wondered if God's going to use you in your life? Have you ever wondered how God could use you, what you should be doing? What are these big grand plans that God has for us? Well, this book will help you find your footing and move forward in faith, as well as growing your relationship with God by using small steps. It's an exciting idea and even helps us through the rough patches. So I hope you stay with us on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Okay, welcome back, everyone. As I said, we have an interesting topic that we're talking about this week. I'd like to introduce you to author Drew Dyck. Now, Drew's been around the publishing world for some time, working at Christianity Today, Leadership Outreach magazine, I believe, and then finally at Moody Publishers, where he's an editor and writer. And he's written several books in the past. Your Future Self Will Thank You, Secrets to Self-Control from the Bible and Brain Science was his prior offering, which, I never got around to read for some reason. But that's another item. Today we're talking about Just Show Up, how small acts of faithfulness change everything. Now, welcome, Drew. I'm glad to have you with me.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, now we've kind of known each other virtually for several years now online. We're kind of hang out at Twitter in the same dusty corners, but
That's
yeah,
right. This is our first conversation, though, I think.
That's yes, our first actual physical conversation. So I'm excited as much as anything else, and we're even in the same time zone, which is an exciting thing. So
Right.
now,
Doesn't happen much.
this book is interesting because if you were to just look at the cover or just read the title, you would think this is kind of a typical self-help manual, that kind of thing, how to get yourself organized. How do I clean the bathroom and keep care of the kids? But that's really not the target that you're shooting for. It's as much a discipleship book and a how to develop and inculcate a relationship with God book as it is anything else. Matter of fact, you have all of the kind of typical, self-help mantras: crash my goals, save the world, hustle harder, all those things. You have them all crossed out on the cover. So why don't you tell me a little bit about Just Show Up and, how this came to be?
Yeah, no, thank you. And you're right. I think at the heart of this is a discipleship book. And it was my wife's idea to actually have those success maxims on the cover and then cross them out, which I love. Because, I in the early pages of the book, as you know, I look back to the early days of my marriage with my wife, Grace, and when I went to seminary and the conversations we'd have back then about changing the world. We had these very idealistic, almost grandiose plans about what we were going to do for God. And then it's funny to even remember that because now, here I am, 18 years later, and I look at my life. It looks pretty average, right? I live in the suburbs. I drive a minivan. We got 3 kids. And then the question becomes, okay, God, what does faithfulness look like now at this stage of life? Or, when some of your early idealistic visions haven't come to pass, at least in the same way that you thought that they would. And honestly, the decision or the conclusion I arrived at is just, it's faithfulness. It's just showing up for the people in your life, for your community, for your family, for your friends, for your church. And the exciting thing to me is that I think God rewards those small acts of faithfulness, right? Mm-hmm. Just being there, being consistent, and over time, those accumulate and will actually lead to a life that has impact. But I've kind of come to the place where I'm like, God, I'm going to abandon the results to you. You decide what you're going to do through my life. I just want to focus on each day, showing up, doing the next thing in front of me, and being faithful.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. I've given a talk before about how being faithful in the little things is super important. And you use Moses in the book as a primary example, but I pointed to him as a person who was it was important to be diligent in his studies. because he would be tasked with writing the first 5 books of the Bible, you know. So it's kind of an important thing. But other little
Big
things, you know, other little things happen. Like David was the runt of the family, so to speak. He's the guy that the dad even said, you don't want to look at him, do you, Samuel?
That's right. Don't worry about that guy.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
He's out in the field with his sheep. But what did David do out in the field with his sheep? He did 2 things. He sat down with his guitar, wrote some songs. You know, that's what you do when you're out for days on end. And it's a bad job, right? Being a shepherd was not the glamour point. It was you had to camp out in the cold and you had to fight against bears and things like that. But that's the other thing he did. You line up all the soda cans and you practice with your sling, just in case a wolf or a lion comes along. And by being diligent in those things, it prepares him for a face-off against a Goliath. He would have never known that. But if he hadn't been diligent in those things, he couldn't have had the preparative wherewithal in order to face the bigger issues. And I think that's a little bit of something that you're trying to develop here.
100%. And I think it's so crucial, especially in our time when people, you know, you go online, you go on social media, and you see people who've blown up overnight and they seem to be wild successes. You know, they got a gazillion people following them on Instagram or something. And then you think it can be a little alienating. You kind of go, God, what's going on with my life? Like, have you put me on the shelf? You know, what's going on? And I think that can be dangerous, that kind of thinking, because honestly, faithfulness is what matters. And God uses that. That's another thing too. When you're in a hard, difficult, discouraging season, it's important to remember you might not even understand what you're learning right now. Like David, you know, practicing with his sling as he's watching sheep in the wilderness, or Moses. But God uses those things to prepare us for what we're going to do in the future. And he uses them in the present as well. And so that's good to remember. You know, God's timeline is often different than the timeline that we might have in mind for us as far as, and I'm not even talking about like being a big success or making a bunch of money, but a lot of people I talk to, they just have a core deep desire that they want to spread the gospel. They want to have an influence on people. They want to help people. Good things, right? And when those don't happen automatically, it can be easy to get discouraged. But I encourage people, man, like God hasn't put you on the shelf. I can guarantee you that. And you might be in training. That's what you don't realize. And you probably can't even see how what you're doing today is going to prepare you for what's coming tomorrow. So hang in there.
Yeah. So another primary example is Joseph. You know, here's a guy where from all accounts, from a worldly position, he's just getting it left and right. And he's like, first of all, he thought he was in a pretty good position. Dad gave him the coat with the stripes on the sleeve. You know, hey, I'm a little bit in charge here. But then his brothers take that away, lie to his father, sell him into slavery. But he lands on his feet, Potiphar's house. Okay, I guess I can live with this, right? And he's faithful to the point of running out of the house instead of being compromised with Potiphar's wife. But his faithfulness results in Potiphar's wife lying about him. Now he's even thrown in jail, right? And it's like, and every time you look at Joseph, it's like he's going down, down, down. And my point was, but that's man's perspective. Let's look at God's perspective. What did God do? God taught Joseph how to manage his family business. Then he taught Joseph how to manage a civil magistrate's household, which is far more complex. Then he taught Joseph how to manage an entire governmental agency in the prison system when he was running. It was only after God grew his responsibility that he was ready to manage the world's food supply. And you see, when we don't look at it from God's perspective, because we don't see those things, we see it from our perspective, then everything changes. And that's part of the point here. Now, you say that we just need to plod, right? Join the plodders. You just make these steps because you just don't know what you're learning. And you're supposed to show up in person. And so tell me why, what do you mean by in person, especially in our digital age today? Why is that important?
Yeah. And I just want to say too, I think Joseph's a great example. Not only was he learning skills, but I think God was doing something to his heart, right? Because he starts as kind of a cocky guy, kind of being a little bit insufferable with his brothers, but God is humbling him and shaping him through that too. And I think the same is true of Moses. And as far as the just showing up in person, man, I think that's huge. Again, especially today, because we're more disconnected, at least physically, than ever. You know, during the pandemic, government shuts down everything. And I think most people had access to a phone or to the internet, at least in this country. And yet rates of anxiety and loneliness and depression shot through the roof because that's not enough to be virtually connected. And I know it's like my life is like totally disconnected. Sometimes I work from home. Most of my meetings are on Zoom, and even there I can, you see if you're in a long Zoom meeting, sometimes all of a sudden people's faces start to disappear, right? And they're just communicating with a disembodied voice. And so even that sometimes is too like personal for us.
That's right.
Right. But anyway, I think that just underscores the importance of actually showing up for people, especially when they're hurting, right? Like when someone is, you can, click the heart emoji or the broken heart emoji, right, or say, I'm praying for your brother, or send a text, which is better than nothing. Don't get me wrong. But man, there's nothing better than showing up for someone who's in a hard, difficult time, who's lost someone, bringing a meal, just sitting with them. One of the stories I share in the book, which I love, is about Beethoven, the composer. And there's a story about him when his buddy lost his son. Beethoven, even though he found conversation difficult and awkward because he was deaf, he goes to the man's house and he spots a piano in the room, and he sits down and he just plays the piano for half an hour. And the guy later says that no other visit had been as meaningful. Wow. And I love that, right? Because, he could have left it to other people. He wasn't articulate. It was awkward. But he showed up, and he did, and he offered what he could, and it was more than enough. And I think that that's true of us too. Like when we show up for people in person, God will, even if we don't feel prepared or we don't have the right thing to say or it's awkward, God will give you something to say. Yeah. He will open up ways that you can uniquely help and bless someone. I think he always puts a piano in the room, to use the story.
Nice.
Some way that we can help people. So that's crucial.
And you also say, show up for church. Yeah, that's the other, right? It's be there in person. And to your point, I tell people, the problem with online churches, everybody, we live in an age that people are used to what I call Pinterest perfect, right? It's you got the coffee cup and the devotional book and the journal and the pen placed just so, and hashtag blessed, and but nobody sees outside the frame that the bed's unmade and the dog is just thrown up on the carpet, and the kid is running around with a saggy diaper, and so we all know that that's true, but everybody still uses that false point as their yardstick. And when you're at church virtually, everybody can be Pinterest perfect, and we suffer from that. Whereas if you're there, if you're walking into service and you look over and you see Joe, and you go, hey, Joe, you look a little down today. What's going on? Oh, no, I'm fine. See, online you can dismiss that, but no, I can tell. You can't do that virtually. Yeah. You have to be there. So it's
absolutely. It's so important, because you're right about, it's funny about, and actually I wish I could be good at taking pictures for Instagram or Pinterest because I always seem to mess it up. There's a weird shadow in a crumb or something, but you're right. It's like, and then I forget who said it, but it's like you end up comparing your everyday life to other people's highlights, right? And that is so destructive, just for our souls and our sense of self-esteem and for pursuing what God really wants us to pursue. And you're right. The antidote for that is community. Right, because that's where you show up and you see messy people and broken people, and you can maybe hide your stuff for a while, but if you're with people enough, they see it too, and that's where you can really be corrected and encouraged and have fellowship. We need that, man. Like a lot of people are like, oh man, it sounds legalistic. Like you can go to church, and I'm not saying like, okay, you got to be. I miss frequently. I'm missing this Sunday because I'm having to travel and all the rest of it. But when you can, be there, and not for a legalistic requirement, but because you need it, and other people need you.
That's right.
Too. And so it's huge. So that's what I say in the book too. Yeah. Show up for church. Even if you're late, that's okay. Yeah. I mean, we've got 3 kids to get ready and a half an hour drive to church. And most of the time we're 5-10 minutes late. But every time I go though, I'll say this is I never regret going, right? It's like, even if you're like not feeling it, you're up late the night before and the weekend's been crazy and you got some work to finish up before Monday and you name it, all the excuses are real. But then you go and you get into the worship, you connect with God, you're fellowshipping with your brothers and sisters in Christ. And I go, man, I'm glad I came. Right. Yeah. And so it's always good to get there. And most of us can go more than we do. I've saw some stats where it's like a generation ago, someone who's considered a like active Christian went to church 3-4 times a month. and now that's like 1.6 or
Wow.
something. And I mean, I don't know what's to blame. It's secularization, it's Sunday soccer, you name it. But and our whole culture kind of works against that commitment.
Yeah.
But if you can make it a priority, yeah, you will not regret it.
Now, Drew, are you more introverted in your? Do a lot of? It strikes me that maybe a lot of external engagements that kind of drain you a little bit. Is that your makeup?
It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I've taken those tests and I'm like right in the middle. So
Okay.
I don't know what
Okay.
that means. But like it's funny when we talk about going out and doing something, my wife Grace is always like, "Yeah, let's go. Come on, let's throw a party. Let's hang out
Right.
with these people." And I'm like, "No, I don't want to do that."
Yeah.
Then when we get there, I'm like the loudmouth life of the party guy. So I don't know what that means.
Okay.
But
Okay. So you.
but
So you're
like
you're
I said,
bipolar
I
relationally.
guess I'm bipolar. I cannot make up my mind. But since so much of my life is, work wise and stuff, and even my social life through social media is mitigated by technology, it is good for me, for my mental health, for my spiritual health, to get out of the house and connect with real human beings. That's the ideal.
Okay. Well, now you had mentioned something just a little bit ago as well about even if you don't feel like it, you do it anyway. And I think that plays into that aspect of the book, your chapter 5, play the role, right? Don't let your feelings dictate what you do, but what you do can change your feelings, so to speak. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And I think it's kind of an unpopular idea probably in our time because we put such a premium on authenticity, which is fine, right? Of course, we want to be authentic, but to the point where sometimes we kind of go, well, if I'm not authentically feeling like worshiping God or reading my Bible or being with someone, then it's almost wrong to do it, not realizing that often our feelings follow our actions, right? Rather than the
Right,
opposite.
right, exactly.
And that's what I've discovered, man. Like, and I remember, I won't name any names. He's a good guy, but I remember this is years ago in a different city that we lived in. My wife was in the hospital, and we had one of the pastors of the church come and visit us. And I remember he comes in, he plops down in the chair beside my wife's bed, and he just starts going, "Man, guys, I'm not feeling like a pastor this week. Things aren't going so well at the church. I don't even know if God called me into ministry." Anyway, he's kind of like airing all these problems, right? And I'm going, dude, we need a pastor right now. We're a little shaken, we're a little rattled. We need someone to pray for us, to be the man of God in the situation. And he was being very authentic, and I felt bad for him, right? That might have been an appropriate conversation for a different time. But sometimes you need to kind of put your feelings aside and perform the role that you've been given in a certain situation. And that was just a good lesson for me
Yeah.
sometimes it's good to perform a role, even though sometimes we think of roles as being restrictive or confining. But I actually think God uses those roles that he's placed us in to glorify himself and to bless others.
Well, yeah, because I mean, and feelings can lie to you as well. Our
Exactly.
society is trapped in this ideology. So, for example, people who are confused and are easily swayed to ideas of perhaps gender confusion, things like that, and so they don't know how to classify their feelings. So therefore, they're just putting it in this box, and then they start running with it because the feelings are there. But your
Yeah.
feelings can lie to you, it's a C.S. Lewis thing. We need someone to basically govern our appetites, and we need men with chests, so to speak.
And that's a tough message, though, today. You're right, because feelings are sacrosanct, right, in our culture. Especially that any inner conviction that you have is almost true just by the fervency with which you hold it, which is an absurd thing if you think about it carefully. And yet that's the kind of MO a lot of people have in their life, that, whatever I feel, over and against reality, over and against, obvious facts, you name it, they'll cling to that. And that can be destructive for our own spiritual lives when we internalize that in numerous ways. But one of those is that when we don't feel something, we are reluctant to do it. We even think it's bad to do things that contradict our feelings. But in truth, if you're going to do anything, if you're going to have a healthy marriage, if you're going to have a good career, if you're going to grow in your relationship with God, it all takes working sometimes against or in spite of feelings for that to happen. So it's just kind of one of those facts of life.
Yeah, it's kind of part of the definition of faith is putting yourself
Yeah.
out there, even though you would maybe be reticent to do so. And
Mm-hmm.
and that becomes even more difficult in times where you're suffering, things like that. And you even have a chapter in there, learning to walk in the rain. Because people may be saying, well, this all sounds good, and I've tried these things before, but then what happened was this crisis hit, and
Right.
I don't know what to do. Or they suffer what I call the Job cascade. Or the Job cascade is you're pressed, and you know that you're afflicted. You know this is a spiritual battle, and you stay faithful to it, and you pray, and it gets worse.
Right.
So now what happens? And so how do you say walking in the rain? What do you mean by that? And what kind of advice does that give in a just show up context?
hmm Yeah, I think that's where it's the hardest and most important, right? To just show up is when something crashes into your life, whether it's kind of a nuisance or something truly tragic. And listen, there are caveats here. Like if you had your life blown up by some kind of catastrophe, you may need to take the time out to heal and to just recover. But most of the things that crash into our lives are somewhere between irritating and tragic. And the truth is we got people counting on us, right? You got a job to do. You've got kids to pick up after school. You've got elderly parents relying upon you. You name it, right? So you can't just check out. So in some ways, it's just a necessity. You have to kind of keep going to some degree. But I think again, back to what you said about faith, that's something that's central to faith too, is that you keep going even when you're discouraged or uncertain. And when I was talking about walking in the rain, I live in the Pacific Northwest where it rains all the time. And it's funny because Portlanders are very strident about this. They're like, we don't use umbrellas, right? Because it's raining anyway. You just take it. You just take it in the head. You keep walking in the rain. And so that's kind of where I got that. But there's wisdom in that. And I think God rewards it. Again, putting your feelings aside, being faithful even in dark periods of your life, knowing that ultimately that God's going to use it. He's going to redeem it. It's not going to last forever usually. But if you kind of freeze up and you disengage from your life and from the people around you, that actually just makes things worse.
Yeah. Back in the 90s when Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all those guys were coming out of the Pacific Northwest, everybody thought the grunge look was this new cool thing, and I was saying, no, that's just how they keep warm up there. They're just always so
The flannels.
The flannels is just and the drippy hair, and that's just life. So
Hilarious.
it's just part of that.
Might be something to that.
Yeah, that's
Might
right.
Be something
That's
to it.
that's right. So, but Drew, there's so much for me to do in all of this. I mean, I have so many things pulling on me. I have so many different commitments. I've got my ministry, I've got my job, I've got my family, and then there's all the other things. If I'm going to be a good Christian, don't I have to help out at the neighborhood soup kitchen, and don't I have to help out every Saturday morning at the park? And how do you manage all of that? How can you just be there for everything?
Yeah. And it's funny too, because when you look online, you see people that are seemingly doing it all, right? And of course, they're not. Either they're lying or they've got a whole bunch of people helping them run their life. And so, yeah, that's a good thing to face right off the top. That is, you can't do it all. You can't, work 60 hours a week and be the perfect parent and chair the PTA and be an elder at your church and on and on and on and on, right? So, one of the chapters I have in the book is let something slide, which doesn't sound very good. But the idea is, you can't show up for everything, man. You got to let something slide. And I've got a whole bunch of things that I let slide. One, I can look out my window right now and see, and that is my yard. I've had kind of fantasies of having a nice yard here and there. And yet it's never happened. And then one day I just realized, you know what? It's not going to happen. I'd have to, the soil's not great. And so we'd have to like resod, and that's expensive. And then I'd have to maintain it. And I'm like, I don't have time for that in my life right now. I'm going to let the kind of brown patches and the dandelions pop up. That's something I'm going to let slide. That's just a small little thing, right? But because I got a busy career and kids and rich community life and all that kind of stuff. And that is more important. So I think, when it comes to this topic of just showing up for things, people can be easily overwhelmed thinking like I have to do everything perfectly. First of all, I'm actually trying to lower the bar. And that is, listen, you don't have to be the best at everything. For those crucial things in your life, just show up. Even if you don't feel prepared, like I said about church, you don't have to do everything and be an elder and lead a small group setting. Just show up for church, right? For spiritual disciplines, you don't have to, master a spiritual discipline with a Latin name. Just crack your Bible every day, right? Then on top of that, I think it's really important to kind of take a clear-eyed look at your schedule and your life and go, what are those obligations that aren't really core for me that I can offload? And then I think the key question I ask myself, this is not like a spiritual thing, but it's like when I think of dropping a certain commitment, what's the primary feeling that I get when I think of doing that? Is it grief or is it relief? And if it's the latter, that's often a good sign that I need to drop something. And of course, you pray about it, commit it to God. And then when you can, and I find that people are understanding too. Sometimes we take on too much because we don't want to say no to anyone. But when you just say, I'm so sorry, I'm in a busy season, I would love to do that, but I can't. Most people are pretty understanding. And then that enables you to free up enough time and energy and bandwidth to show up for the things that truly matter most.
Oh, you're a writer, so I would imagine that you have to say, well, got deadlines.
Right.
Yeah. What was the old quote? I love deadlines. I love the sound they make when they wish past me.
Wish past me. That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, deadlines, man. That's a love-hate relationship. Yeah. I don't think I'd written one book without a deadline. Yeah. So I am ultimately appreciative.
But this is an interesting message because I don't hear this a lot, say, from the pulpit. I don't hear, and we do sometimes get so busy in the service of the King that we forget to stop and worship the King, or just the fact that we don't understand that. Somebody once told me as I was jumping into ministry myself, they said one of the most important words and one of the most useful words in your entire ministry is the word no, where you can focus that. But do you hear this from the pulpit? I mean, I don't. It's almost like you hear messages more often coming from the other direction.
Yeah, good point. I think that's true. And often, you hear sermons about the necessity of saying no to sin. That's great. That's crucial, of course. But I think the trickier thing for most Christians are the things that are a little more in the gray, a little more ambiguous. Maybe it's a good thing that you could be doing. Maybe you could be coaching Little League, but at this time of your life, there's just not enough bandwidth for that. And so how do you evaluate those things? Picking out the best from among the merely good. So that is tricky. And that's where discernment is so important, and prayer. When you submit something to God in prayer, and then you kind of get a feeling like, you know what, that's not something I should do. I think that gives you a lot of freedom then to pull the plug on it and move along. And you know what, when that's happened in my life, I've never regretted it. I've never gone back and went, man, why did I drop that? When I've done it, intentionally and something I've prayed about, I've always been relieved and appreciative for the extra time.
And where does outside counsel, maybe asking friends and family, how does that work into this situation as well?
That's huge. And I should have mentioned that. Absolutely. Of course, the first person I always ask is my wife, but then you can, broaden it out. And cause it's so funny, we're not great at really knowing ourselves, or sometimes even when it comes to our strengths and opportunities. And it's really good to get a little bit of objectivity from people that know us, that can look at that and go, that's not you. You don't need to be doing that right now. You're already overcommitted here. Why don't you focus on this? So, I mean, if you've got those trusted advisors and friends, that's huge, right? What does the Bible say? There's safety in a multitude of counselors. And I think that certainly applies when it comes to this topic.
Yes, exactly. And I often maintain that God gives us our wives in order to make sure we know where our flaws are. So it's, because 100%. she's not impressed by your CV.
No. She's not even impressed with my jokes. That's the sad thing.
Maybe if you pick the underwear up off the floor, she might be a little bit.
That'll impress her. That's right.
Yeah. What was that you said, that there was a story in the book where you were talking about a person that was looking for God's leading, and he was torn between two girls that he was interested in, and he picked up the Bible and he started reading, and he read the Psalms where it said you should pursue joy, and so joy was the girl that he decided to continue the relationship with, and I was reading that. I thought about, the old pastor who would preach Proverbs 31, right? And it gets to that passage, her price is far above rubies. And some joker in the back says, well, what's ruby's price? But yeah, that's not the way it normally happens. That's not how God normally leads you. How does God normally lead you?
Yeah, and I chuckle at those things. And here's the thing God can do and does, unusual things, right? And maybe that worked for someone when they flip open the Bible and it just leads them to the perfect verse, or they see a sign in the sky, or you name it. But I would say most often God leads us in more prosaic ways. Nonetheless, supernatural and miraculous and beautiful, but ways that are a little more ordinary. And I find too, and I got a lot of this growing up, this kind of like mysterious thing of, okay, how are you going to find God's will? And you got to look at the signs and read the tea leaves, and you don't want to miss it. No, man, if you sin and mess up, you might miss it altogether. And I think those aren't terribly helpful. I think the best advice that I've gotten is just like I say in the book, you don't find God's will with your head, you find it with your feet. So as you start moving in a certain direction, God starts to guide you. I think that's often, as I look back at my life, I didn't always have perfect clarity when I set out in a new direction, but you just got to do something. You got to start moving, and then God can kind of direct you from there. Because as you go, I mean, yeah, we talked about the stories of Moses and Joseph and stuff. Man, they went on some crazy journeys, right? And they could have never predicted where it would land, but only as we're moving can God lead us. And so that's a good encouragement, especially for people that are younger. Actually, all of us. I mean, as you go through your life, it's not like you ever arrive and it's like, oh man, I finally figured it all out. But especially for people that are younger, that are trying to figure out like, okay, what should I do for a career? Who should I marry? Should I get married? All those questions. Just start moving. Like, be faithful. You don't have to worry that you're going to miss the boat. Don't worry. God's got you. He's going to guide you.
Well, especially with young people, you're kind of fighting a trend that technology is setting that kind of contradicts that. So there's two things in technology that I notice immediately. One is the accessibility of the immediate. If you want an answer, you can just Google it. You have it at your fingertips. May not be in context, but it's the most popular one. Or if you want, whatever item, Amazon gets it right here immediately. So this idea
Same day delivery,
long haul is kind of a counter to that. But the other piece that you're fighting is the idea that you would actually delve deeply into something and stick with it. You're not gonna, what did you say, Netflix surf, I think is the term that you use, where our attention span is only about 5 seconds and we're jumping on to the next thing. So these are two things that young people, I think especially, are going to have a lot of, or at least struggling with, because that's how they've learned to interface with the world. How do you suggest we overcome those kinds of things?
Yeah. And I borrowed some of those ideas from an author named Pete Davis. He talks about infinite browsing mode, this kind of, what you do with Netflix. And I've done this. Grace and I will sit down at night sometimes and you go, what should we watch? And you start browsing, and all of a sudden, like half an hour's gone. You haven't watched anything, but you've just been browsing because you're scared of committing to one show, right? You're just not quite satisfied with what you're seeing. And he relates that to how a lot of people, especially the younger generation, are living their lives. They're on infinite browsing mode, and they're kind of paralyzed to actually pick a path and go with it because they're overwhelmed by so many options. And he contrasts that with what he calls long haul heroes, which I love. And he talks about like his piano teacher who sat and taught piano for 30 years in the same house on the same street. Or, he talks about Mr. Rogers, filming thousands of episodes, and people that just kind of committed to a certain path, dug in, and made an impact by being sometimes just quietly faithful over the long haul. And I think that's something that, again, young people especially need to hear, is that ultimately, if you're going to have a life of meaning, of impact, of fulfillment, if you really want to do something for God, that often requires being a long haul hero, not, flitting around the globe and just trying to find your next adventure or the next sexiest thing. There's going to be long stretches of that are boring, that are hard, where you're going to have to push through. But again, ultimately, that leads to a life of flourishing and an impact for the kingdom.
Boy, boring, man. I hear that from young people today. It's almost like a cardinal sin to be bored.
Yes.
And
My
it,
kids accuse me of that all the time. Dad, we're bored. What are
yeah,
you doing
what,
here? Yeah.
what, I, I'm bored. It's boring. It's like, that's, you know what? That's actually a good thing from time to time, because you could actually stop and think about stuff. Now there was a sociologist who felt he was himself contemplating these. I wish I just had some time where I didn't have any pressures. I could just think. And he goes, I bet you a lot of people are interested in that. So he set up an experiment where he would put people alone in a room, and he would say, all we want you to do is sit in a chair and think for 15 minutes, right? And if you can't do that, then there's a button on the table that'll administer an external shock to, have that way you have an external stimuli. And what he found is most people would take the shock, especially men. About 66% of the men would rather shock themselves than sit alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes, because we've trained ourselves to have all of this external stimulus that we feel isolated, right? I challenge people this all the time. I say, heck, just when you're driving, when you have a long haul drive someplace, turn off the radio, make it complete silence, see how long you can go without any external stimulus, and you're still driving. I mean, it's not like you're in a, isolation chamber. No. But most people, no, I got to have my music, or I got to have my, and that's
Listen to a podcast,
that's
audiobook.
The
Yeah.
we're in.
Oh, I know. It's crazy. I just read this book, Dopamine Nation, that talks a lot about this, just that constant need for stimulus that we have. And I feel this in my own life, man. I'll go to Chipotle, which is just a few miles away, and and then if I forget my phone, I'm just itching, like, oh, I'm reaching for it, right? Because you just get like you're in line for a second. Oh, you got your phone. You get that immediate stimulus, even when you don't have to really check it or look at your email. And it's destructive in so many ways for relationships, but I think also for the life of the mind and for our imaginations, right? And people wonder, like, why do I have such great thoughts in the shower? Maybe it's because you don't have your stinking phone in there. It's like the one place where you can't have your phone with you.
That's right.
Maybe you can. You got one of the waterproof ones, I guess. But yeah, I think we lose more than we realize by constantly having to be entertained and stimulated by technology, especially.
Yeah, I Silence and Solitude. Dallas Woodward, matter of fact, in his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, puts those up there. How can you hear from God if your life is so noisy with all this other stuff? So, yeah, 100%. I agree. But we got to be careful, right? One of the chapters in your book is not becoming an escape artist. So what's the other, boundary that we're talking about on this?
Yeah. So I talked about my little escapist behavior during the pandemic, stuck at home, and I started looking at houses online. I think a lot of people did. I think like Zillow and Redfin, those apps that have houses for sale, got a lot more traffic. And I just started fantasizing about like getting a bigger house. And then all of a sudden I started looking at my house and I'm like, man, this thing stinks. It's fine. My house is fine. It's got, enough bedrooms for my family, and it's got a garage, and we're fine. But all of a sudden you start looking at these other big houses and your house doesn't look so good. And it took me a while because I was spending like a couple hours a day doing this. It's kind of embarrassing to even admit. And I remember at one point, Grace looks over my shoulder and she's like, "What are you doing? We're never going to afford a house like that." And I thought, not with that attitude. But she was right. I was in kind of a fantasy world, and I realized that it was an escapist behavior for me to kind of avoid the work that I was supposed to be doing, whether it was my job, being with the kids. Sometimes I'd check out when I got bored with them and I'd go on this app. And I think a lot of us have those things, and it's different for everyone, right? Maybe it's just like playing video games till 3 a.m. And it's fine to have little hobbies, and sometimes you need that outlet, or Netflix or whatever. But I think sometimes they can become so dominant where you're actually frittering away hours a day, or it's taking a toll on your relationships. And that's where it's important, I think, to kind of get back to the in-person thing, make sure you're kind of getting out of the house and actually engaging with real human beings. And then B, I think sometimes when you engage in escapist behaviors, it's because you've neglected the things that your soul needs, right? You're not slaking your spiritual thirst with the things of God. You're not connecting with God in prayer and through fellowship with other believers and all those important spiritual disciplines. And so you resort to these other things because you're still thirsty. And so when you can just start, like, one thing I've been trying to do is just like, instead of checking my phone in the morning, opening the Bible, even if it's just for like a brief period of time, just starting the day before all the news, all the tragedies that you imbibe, all the, the emails coming at you and everything like that, just connecting with God first thing, getting that connection. And then it just seems to make a difference throughout the course of my day. So yeah, I'm proud to say that I deleted the Redfin app off my phone and try to avoid that. But I think we can all, do well to look at some of the behaviors and go, is that escapist behavior? Is that actually keeping me away from God's call on my life and sucking up time and resources that I don't have? And often I think the answer is yes.
See, I may be a little bit jealous of your house because my desk doesn't have my bookshelf behind me, so I can't. In my podcasts, I don't have as an impressive backdrop yet. But,
how do you know it's real, though?
Yeah, it's a good question.
That's just to make me look smart, And what I need to do, what other authors have done, I've noticed, is like you need your book that you've written like face out behind you. I don't know if that actually.
Yeah, that's right. You got to show the title, got to show the cover, right?
That's right.
It's like a car commercial. Either it's one way or the other. You got to show the product. Absolutely. Yeah. But it is true. It's easier. And we had mentioned this before, that when you start judging either your life next to the peaks of other people's lives or things like that, that's where envy really starts to creep in, and it can be something that really tears you away from success. And part of this is, of course, in our connected culture, much easier to fall into. When it used to be, people used to say, when we used to live in small towns, when it was, basically the primary mode of communication was walking, and you only lived within a certain mile radius, the most beautiful girl in your idea of beauty was different because you were comparing them to the local population. Your idea of engagement was different, and of course you were more present in other people's lives because you saw them more. You could engage with them more, and it was necessary. Plus, you also knew that what hurt one part of the community hurts the whole community, and that made a big difference as well. And it's really, I think, modern technology with its benefits has a lot of significant flaws and faults that people don't count on. And it seems to me that some of what you're trying to do is, at least in a positive way, hope to correct some of those misunderstandings. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way modern life is at odds with how God wired us. We aren't. I mean, even when it comes to, like you said, comparing yourself to other people, right? You're comparing yourself. I hop online, I'm comparing myself to the best-selling authors in the world, right? Come on, Drew, why didn't your books sell that much? Or, if you're a young girl, you're comparing yourself to all these beautiful, perfectly thin people all over the world. That can be really destructive for a young woman's psychology. You name it, it goes on. And then on top of that, you are inundated with every disaster that happens around the world, right? I mean, this week, right now, I won't even get into it, but what's happening in Israel is almost impossible to avoid, and it's just awful. But I don't think we were designed to take in every tragedy that comes up, every earthquake, every war. Even like when you jump on social media and there's like someone that you knew in second grade, they're getting divorced, and someone's lost a child, and all awful things. The problem is often your attention is bigger than your ability to help. And so you can maybe offer some thoughts and prayers, and you can pray, and I'm not minimizing that. But psychologically, I think that can be a lot for us to take on. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in narrowing our focus. And I talk about that in the book too, right? I'd say something about like investing in fewer people in order to have a greater impact ultimately.
Yeah, go deeper.
Go deep. Exactly. Go deep rather than broad when possible. Not that there's anything about, hey, we're on a podcast. We hope that lots of people listen to this. There's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, let's be honest, where's the deepest impact that you're going to have in your life? It's going to be with your neighbors, with your children, with your spouse, with your family and friends, with your church community, with the people that, build into your life. I remember when I was the editor of Leadership Journal, publication for pastors. And we did this one roundup where we asked these pastors to like talk about the biggest influences on their lives. And honestly, I thought they would like talk about all these big preachers that, this person influenced my preaching and my thinking. But it was all these mentors that you'd never even heard of, right? That built into their lives. that were there. Maybe they're the youth pastor or someone who came alongside them, usually when they were young and built into their life. That's ultimately where we make our biggest difference. And so it's good to remember that and to go, you know what, it's okay to strain out, filter all the noise and the messages coming at me. Even sometimes you feel bad for doing that, but I think it can be healthy so that you can have more energy, more time to devote to a smaller number of people.
Well, yeah, today we live, and we're reading it over and over again, that there is a significant crisis in mental health among the youth. Depression rates have reached an all-time high, that kids are not able to kind of balance in a proper way. And I think a lot of these stressors are due to the way they're comparing themselves to one another. In the church, we see the same kind of thing. And you mentioned this in the book as well. And it's something that I've been working on a little bit myself. Of course, everybody's concerned about the deconversion movement, right? The deconstruction, the evangelicals. Why is it that when we send our kids to college, they're not coming back to the faith? What's changed? What's happened? And how does this help maybe with our children? How can we help them in these walks? Will this make a difference in how they see faith long term as well?
Yeah, no, it's huge. I my first book I actually wrote on the topic of well, I don't want to say, deconstruction. That wasn't really the talk then, but it was on the topic of young people that had grown up in the church and then walked away from the faith, not just the church, but their faith altogether. And I don't really get into the theology of like what happens there. Were they ever Christians in the first place? Did they really leave? I just kind of listened to their stories, and it was eye opening. And basically what I discovered, it was good. It was a good discipline for me too, because I love to argue, and instead I had to just kind of play the journalist and hear their stories and just listen sometimes for 2 or 3 hours. But one big takeaway for me was I remember talking to one young woman who had come through a Christian college, and she had this pretty impressive case against God. You could tell she'd been reading all the New Atheists and like Dawkins and Hitchens and those folks. And it was only after about an hour of that kind of presenting her intellectual doubts that she told me about this awful experience that she had in her Christian college, where she felt betrayed by her Christian friends and kind of isolated from the community. And it was after that she made the decision to walk away. And then it was only subsequently to that she'd built this kind of elaborate intellectual case against God. And I'm not dismissing any of her doubts. Intellectual doubts are real and need to be dealt with. But often what I discovered is that the break often comes in the context of relationship. And then getting back to this topic, I encourage, parents of people who had left the faith and friends, Christian friends of people who had left, is that if the break came in the context of relationship, if they're going to come back, it's probably going to be in the context of relationship. And again, that's something that, and you're probably well aware of this statistic, but like the number one predictor of, and this was the Fuller Youth Institute talks about this, the number one predictor of whether someone is going to retain his or her faith is whether or not they have that intergenerational relationship with an older Christian. And yet we often assume, man, you got to get a cool youth pastor or a smoke machine in the sanctuary or something like that. But it's really just those connections with older Christians that often makes the difference.
So do we do a disservice to our Christian youth by isolating them to youth group ministry and making these different age appropriate quote unquote levels of Sunday service? I mean, maybe we should mix it up a little bit. Maybe that.
Yeah, 100%. Now, I'm not like totally down on youth ministry or youth pastors. I think they're necessary. There
I
are
agree.
certain things you can't talk about with grandma in the room, right? So that's good. But if that's their sole engagement with the church, that's very bad. That's very dangerous, because what happens is their only connection is to that youth group, that youth leader. Then when they age out of that ministry, they age out of the church altogether. I think this is what we've seen over and over. And so, yeah, they need to okay, let's have the youth group, but then let's have other ways of fostering those intergenerational connections, having them more invested in the life of the church, and flipping that switch as early as possible, where they're not just, okay, there's big church and there's little church for the kids, but really integrating them more and more. I think we didn't know that, I think, a generation ago. We didn't realize how important those connections were. But now that we do, we really need to rethink church ministry in light of it.
I agree. I had Jana Harmon, Side B podcast. I'm sure if you're familiar with her, but
yes.
She interviews at least over 100 atheists. She's interviewed her ex-atheists, and what are the things that drove your atheism? What are the things that brought you back to the church? And she underscores your point. Yeah, it ultimately is relational. And Paul Vitz in Faith of the Fatherless has made a kind of a similar argument if you look at it. But I think, and in my own personal experience, it's interesting when you even look at the stories of the deconverts, the ex-evangelicals, even those who were previously prominent. They found something flawed within the practice of their faith. It may be intellectual, many times it's emotional, but instead of rejecting the flaw, they reject everything outright. It seems to be an all or nothing package. And that does concern me. And as you say, it concerns me where and again, we live in an outsourced society, right? We don't, I think you even brought this up. We don't take walks in nature. We watch nature programs on our television. We don't we don't study our politics. We listen to our talking heads tell us what we should vote for. We don't play any sports games. We live through them vicariously on Sunday afternoon or Monday night. And it's no wonder that when you outsource all that, when you become that passive, that there is no real connection. And if it's not scratching your itch in this area now, well, maybe I can just change the channel and take it in a whole different way, which is, I think, a big problem. So
huge. And the opportunity here, though, is that in an age when people are so disconnected and the offerings of online life are so shallow ultimately and leave people kind of empty, the church is that one community that can step up and be radically different, very embodied, and give people a place to really connect with each other and with God. And so, the internet can't compete with that. When it comes to online church, which I get is necessary for certain situations or people that are stuck at home because they're sick or something. But, ultimately, I bet you there's another live stream that's better than your church's live stream, right?
But nobody can simulate a true hug. I mean, sometimes
100%.
And even though you don't even know that you need it, man, when that happens, all of a sudden it's like you just feel the difference. And exactly. We argued during COVID, what is an essential service, and our beloved state said church wasn't, and I argued to the contrary. I said there is no other institution that cares for the soul. You have to care for both body and soul. I argued this at the time, and of course, nobody listens to me. Of course, I'm not. The government doesn't, but when we now see the mental health rates, when you see the mental health rates,
everyone had enough food and digital connection, but
we stocked up on toilet paper. We got that,
but it wasn't enough, right? Even when your physical needs are met, like I said, all the rates of every mental health indicator was terrible, right? Because we were disconnected. So no, you're right. The church is absolutely essential.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did want to point, I love the way the book is not a hard read. It's light. It's able to be, I think parents could give this to their teenage children who are still trying to figure out where they land, and I think it would be helpful. I think they should read it themselves first, actually, to make sure that, because it's easy for us to assume that we've got it all together until the storms hit, right? Until the rain comes. And then you hit that Job cascade and you start really questioning. And I've talked about that before on the podcast, so I won't bore our listeners with, what happened in my life when that happened. But you need to know what you believe, why you believe, and who you believe in. And then, hand it to your kids after that and let them read it. And I think they would appreciate the realness of it. And it might be something completely different than they've heard before.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Recently, my last book, the one on self-control, Your Future Self Will Thank You, someone said that his 12-year-old read it and enjoyed it. And I said, okay, did he understand it all? And he's like, oh yeah, no problem. And I was like, oh boy, I don't know whether that's an insult or a compliment, but I was grateful.
What the Fletcher Cascade Index of rating comparability, right? That's not how we should rate our work, I guess. Yes. So what do you hope people will take away from? And by the way, is the book on sale now? I know it comes out this month. It's on sale now.
Yeah. Well, it came out last week, so okay. Yeah, it's brand new, but it is on sale.
Okay, and we'll have a link to it. They say. Yeah, we'll have a link to it below the video here. So great. So what do you hope people will take away?
Man, I hope people are encouraged. I hope they are, because I think a lot of, again, in our time of social media where it seems like everyone's striving to get famous or they're famous, I hope people can feel a sense of encouragement that God's not done with them. God's going to use you, that they'll be energized to show up for the people around them. And like you said, it is kind of a light, short read. And so I hope they have a few chuckles as well and come away with a renewed desire to live a life of ordinary faithfulness that ultimately results in extraordinary things.
Oh, that's great. Any any peanut butter and jelly stains on the first manuscript? I just didn't know. Maybe.
Probably.
I figured that. Well, yeah, this has been great. Now you're a Fuller guy, is that right, Drew? Is that where you?
That's right. Okay. Yeah, I went to.
So did you go during? Was Christian Smith there when he was doing his study on the young people and
moralistic therapeutic deism? That's right. I don't think he was. I'm trying to remember what were the years I was there. 2006 to.
Yeah, you were after him.
I was after him. Yeah. So it's funny though because I don't know, in the evangelical world, Fuller's probably, I think it's safe to say, a little left of center. I was a little more on the conservative end while I was there, but that's okay. I had a great experience, and I joke with my more conservative friends that I got saved after I graduated from Fuller, but that's not true.
That's right. Well, Oliver Crisp is at Fuller, right? So
they're great people.
Yeah, there's some really good teachers there as well. Absolutely.
John Piper went to Fuller. Can you believe that? Well, of course, that was like the 70s.
Yeah, that was everything's a moving target. It seems.
Yes, isn't that true?
Anything else that I should be thinking about while we have you?
Oh no, that I appreciate the conversation. And if people do get a chance to check out the book, I'd love them to connect with me. I spend too much time on Twitter or whatever it's called now, X. Or you can drop by my website, Drew Dyck, Dyck is my last name, .com. And you can see some cheesy pictures of my family. You can read the first chapter for free. And here, this ties into the theme. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, drop by. Let's have coffee, man. Like in person, face to face. That would be the ideal.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll tell you what, we're working on doing a Dare to Defend conference up in the Portland area.
Oh, awesome.
And so I will pull on you, and maybe we can have you do a speaking session on this.
Count me in.
Would be great. Okay.
That's awesome.
Are you friends with Roger and Mary Jo Sharp and some of those folks who are up that way?
I know those names, but no.
She's out of Houston Christian University now.
Oh, sure.
She's and she's written a couple of books and things like that. And there's some other folks up that way that I'm working with, but hopefully we'll pull something together early next year. But I'll pull you in. I think it'd be a lot of fun. So
absolutely, and I'll help you spread the word up here because we need it. There are like no Christian conferences up here. We joke that there are like 10 Christians in the Northwest, and we all know each other. So.
Yeah, I'll be glad to do so. That'd be a lot of fun. Okay, well, so great talking with you, and I'll definitely plan on hooking up when I'm up there, one way or the other. We'll make sure we do get that
Perfect.
cup of coffee.
It's a plan.
All awesome. Right, Drew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lenny. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.